Welcome to Dear Human Resources, the podcast where we explore how work is evolving and what that evolution means for HR leaders, for organizations, and the people behind the work. I'm your host, Germain. Today's episode sits at the intersection of three forces that are reshaping HR strategy right now: AI, compliance, and the rise of high-skill independent workers. Many HR teams are navigating a reality where work is happening faster, it's happening across borders, and increasingly outside traditional employment models, if you will, often without additional internal resources to manage it all. So to help us make sense of that shift, I'm delighted to welcome Colleen Tiner to our podcast show here. Colleen is Beeline Chief Product Officer, and she leads the company's AI-related initiatives. Colleen, welcome to the show.
Marilyn, thank you for the invitation and for having me today. I'm looking forward to it.
So let's start with what many HR teams are seeing day to day. Employees and independent workers are using artificial intelligence to get more done in less time. So from your perspective, Colleen, how is that changing the way work actually shows up inside organizations? And what does that mean for how HR should be designing workflows?
My observation is that, and I work with a lot of large global, I would say the global 2000 companies, and in talking with all of my stakeholders, the observation that I've made, especially in the past 12 months, is that we're in a whole new season of work. And AI is really shining a light on and making that visible, I should say. It's not just adding productivity or speed, which it is doing, but it's also changing the shape of work itself. So tasks are more modular, they're more outcome-based, they're far less tied to time or location where the work is being performed, or even the type of engagement, whether that's employment or contingent worker, as you mentioned. And AI, I think, has really started to change what it means to be flexible, to be autonomous, and it's created a more results-driven workforce that can scale. So I think that's the advantage. How we see that specifically manifesting in organizations, for instance, employees are using AI to stretch in their roles, and they're focusing on higher value work because they're able to get more done more quickly on or faster on those tactical type of tasks. Independent workers are using it to scale themselves, and they're using it as a business to deliver more sophisticated outcomes faster. And I have a stat for you. One of our business units, MBO, Partners by Beeline, runs a State of the Independent report every year. And they found in that report that 74% of independent workers use generative AI. And most of them tell us that the AI is amplifying their work. They do not perceive that as a threat in any way. On average, they report to us that they are saving 9 hours per week just by allowing AI to help them amplify their work. So I think there's a productivity gain, but there's also a value gain for the employees and the independents as well, and for the company. For HR, which was kind of where your question was framed, for HR specifically, it's really, I think the shift is focusing on not just productivity and measuring productivity. It's about measuring impact. Workflows that were designed around job titles or hours worked or headcount are going to kind of start breaking down. A smarter approach that we're starting to see companies use is designing their workflows and their governance around capabilities, outcomes, and risk across all workers, not just employees. And I think HR in the past has sort of had this push and pull between full-time workers or employee workers versus non-employee workers. And those things, capabilities, outcomes, and risk, really apply across the board to anyone that is providing value to your organization and helping you run your business. So AHR isn't managing a single employee workforce anymore. We're seeing HR becoming stewards of an entire work ecosystem: employees, contractors, independents, even platforms and AI tools or agents, all contributing to outcomes. So what I've heard that job for HR now called is orchestration, not control. So that's how we really see it different in terms of workflows.
So HR professionals shouldn't worry about losing their jobs?
No, by all means, no.
I'm sure they're going to love hearing that from you.
I hope so.
So that brings me to risk, right? We're
Yes.
hearing more about candidate fraud, about worker misclassification, and cross-border compliance problems, right? So especially as more high-scale work moves outside traditional payroll. According to you, what are the biggest risk areas HR leaders should be paying attention to right now?
Marilyn, what's really interesting, and I've been with Beeline for 20 years now, I would say that risk had always been maybe number two, oscillated between number two and number three in sort of like what's most important on our customer's mind. And typically, what happens is number one was either access to talent or cost savings. And I would say in the past 9 to 12 months, risk has taken first place. For the first time in my career, risk is number one for the exact reasons that you just mentioned. And I think that's because when work is faster, when it's more distributed, when there's more AI enablement, and there's less tied to the definition of a traditional role or a traditional location, HR has to be able to answer some essential questions with confidence. And those questions are, who is this person? Are they actually qualified and compliant with the rules that matter? And once they're engaged, is the right person actually doing the work? And the reality is, answering these questions has really become a lot more complex. And I can give you some examples. The who is this person and should they be here at all? What we're seeing HR teams needing to address up front are the fraud risk associated with things like identity theft, repeated bad actors circulating through your organization, and fake credentials. There are a lot of mechanisms that we're seeing HR apply, both technology mechanisms as well as process mechanisms like identity vetting and anti-impersonation tools that look at biometric verification, liveness detection, that's the newest one we've been challenged with, and device authentication tied to identity. Things like do not rehire and eligibility. So managing known risk lists and rehire policies as people are coming in the door, not just once they're, onboarded. And then, of course, what we've traditionally held, which is background checks and history validation, looking at employment history, education, criminal record reference checks, those types of things are still valid. But now there's this layering of additional evaluation that needs to happen. And these questions really are relevant no matter how you're engaging the person as an employee, as a contingent worker, as an IC or consultant. Those risks are all the same, if they're accessing your buildings, your systems, your IP, those types of things. This type of validation and risk protection is really important. Secondly, depending on your industry, answering the question, does this person meet legal, regulatory, and compliance requirements can be really complicated at scale. Risk can vary by role and location. So we're seeing automation and AI and processes are being combined to solve things like qualification fraud, which is where workers they might be real, you've validated their identity, but the skills they're proclaiming or maybe a supplier is proclaiming on their behalf maybe or credentials aren't necessarily validated. And how do you validate that? Background checks to validate the historical trustworthiness, as I mentioned, but compliance and credential tracking, things like licenses, training, expiration dates, and verification of those credentials is now like sort of the next level. Skill certification and validation, there's been a lot of pre-hire and pre-contract testing, but now we're seeing more and more things like validated digital badges and more structured feedback from prior history for specifically tied to skills. And then finally, I would say the third sort of question HR needs to answer when it comes to risk doesn't really end at onboarding. It's actually, and we see this more on the contingent labor side or independent contractor side than on the employee side, which is really making sure that you have confidence that the person you've approved to work is the person actually doing the work. And we've heard a lot in the news, about these organizations, whether they're states or actual organizations that are basically getting work and then farming that work out and either not realizing or not caring that that farming of work out puts the company at risk if it doesn't go through the proper vetting process. So this is probably the area where we're getting the most risk attention right now from our customer base. Is the right person showing up and doing the work they were assigned? Preventing ghost work, as I described, unauthorized substitution. So this one's interesting. It's work that is not performed where it is intended. So crossing borders, whether that's state borders in the United States or country borders, potentially where there is legal or tax ramifications, if you are not aware that that work is not being performed where you had intended. And then the other problem that we're seeing that customers are working with HR teams to put risk mitigation and controls in place is proxy time logging. Is somebody putting in time on behalf of someone else? And are you losing, there's a lot of time fraud that happens there. 15 minutes, thousands of times adds up to a lot of money when you're paying an hourly rate, for instance. So we're seeing clients deploy some really sophisticated controls around post-onboarding verification, like geofence clock-ins, device-based access control. I mentioned before biometric, they're doing that at check-ins as well. And what's really challenging, I know for a lot of our customers, is balancing this type of risk mitigation and control with data privacy concerns, because it is a very, very fine line to protect the company, but also protect the individual themselves and their privacy. So there's a lot happening in this space. I think it's really important for HR leaders to educate themselves, research what's available, understand their company's risk tolerance policy, and apply these needs and these risk controls across the entire workforce, because the risk doesn't change based on how the person is engaged.
So you mentioned a little bit ago, liveness detection. That's definitely a new term for many HR professionals. So if I get this right, it's some sort of biometric security technology that makes sure that a user is not fake. And is that right?
Yeah, so in what we're seeing in anti-impersonation and identity vetting tools, whether that's a one-time before you get on an interview, doing a verification that you are who you say you are, or as you do a validation, for instance, like you approve as an individual, you're approving your candidate submission, like you're applying for this job. There will a lot of times be an identity verification. Those identity verifications are not just having you hold up your ID and your facial recognition, but it's doing a detection on if you're actually like what it's seeing in the camera is real or it's AI generated. And there's very sophisticated technology out there that can detect an AI generated person holding an ID versus a live person holding an ID.
Wow. I mean, people are going to get busted.
Yes. Yes.
Eventually.
If we're doing all of our jobs correctly, we will prevent that type of risk. But it's similar to cybersecurity, it's just a never ending, there's always something to go after, and to protect yourself from.
Well, that definitely is a safe field to get into. Colleen, you have worked closely with highly paid independent professionals, people who can essentially choose who they work for. So what do those workers look for when deciding whether to take on a project? And where do companies tend to get it wrong?
I'm really glad you are bringing this topic up, because what we've seen with independent contractors, I would say a decade ago, many global 2000 companies, and even today, there are still some who just refuse to use independent contractors because of the perceived risk around using them. There are so many more controls in place and services available now to leverage this highly competent, highly skilled workforce of independent professionals. And those that are have had to learn a lot. Marilyn, you're exactly right that there are things that can go wrong and you really miss out when they do. So what we know is that highly skilled independents don't think of themselves as workers. They think of themselves as businesses. And so it's important to keep that in mind. The decision that they are making is not, do I like this company? It's more, is this a client I want in my portfolio? They're looking at things like clarity, speed, respect, Is the scope clear? Are decisions made quickly? Do I trust that I'll get paid on time? Those are the things that highly skilled independent workers are really thinking about. And a stat, again, from the report that I mentioned earlier, there are about 5.6 million independents now that earn over $100,000 a year annually, US. And that's nearly double since 2020. So this has definitely been a growth area. And if companies are not tapping into this talent source, they're missing a huge opportunity. We have found that over half, about 64% of them, of those highly comped independents, say feeling valued for their work is one of the top factors when they're choosing a client. And that value ranks as high as the pay itself, what they're actually being compensated. So when you ask what companies tend to get wrong, it really lands on when they treat independents like employees without benefits. Lots of process, lots of oversight. That starts to make it feel heavy and slow. Or when they treat independents like a faceless vendor because they are working directly with your workforce. They're a natural extension of that workforce. So neither of those things goes well. So if your process feels slow, this is a big one. It feels unclear because that clarity is so important for an independent because they, again, are running a business and they're focused on outcomes. Or if it feels transactional, this elite level of talent will self-select out. They will kind of get the work done and not come back, or they will just opt out in general if it just starts off as, on the wrong foot. Even if the work is interesting, if those things, speed and clarity and relationship aren't there, they will self-select out. So again, I think really focusing on giving them clear problems to solve, giving them outcome-based scope, and putting trust in their judgment. They're highly comped, highly skilled professionals, and they have a perspective and have a lot of experience at a lot of different companies, and they bring that to the equation. So really leveraging that. I think that's probably the most important thing to think about. What I would add to this probably is employees want a lot of the same things now too. So while independents are leading the charge, employees also want clarity. They also want to focus on outcomes. They don't want to be micromanaged for the most part. I guess the difference is independents have optionality. They can just walk away. Unlike an employee who typically would give a notice and have a longer transition or maybe might stay longer to kind of get things worked out. An independent has a lot of options available to them at any given time.
Yeah, those are fantastic points, Colleen. Now, many HR teams are being asked to rely more on contingent and independent talent without adding internal headcount. What are
Mm-hmm.
some practical ways HR can integrate these workers into workforce planning without creating chaos or extra administrative burden?
I think the first thing I usually say is, and I mentioned it in the last question that you had, is just don't try to manage your independent or your contingent workers the same way you manage employees. That's kind of where it gets chaotic. It is important to keep the separation. The goal isn't oversight, it's clarity, and I can't stress that enough. And I don't think it's possible for HR to be in every transaction, in every engagement with their business stakeholders who are bringing in independents or bringing in contingent workers. But HR does need to have confidence and provide the right guardrails, that the business understands the policies, can apply them, that isn't overwhelmed by the heaviness of them. Because the goal ultimately, I believe, when I talk to HR experts and leaders, is they want to ensure that their business people can get the right people engaged, that the work they're doing is compliant, and that their expectations are clear on both sides. So really making sure that your business stakeholders understand how to engage the different types of workers to make sure that that work is compliant and how to set expectations. I think that's the key. The most successful teams that I've worked with start thinking in terms of work. What outcomes do we need? What risks do we need to manage? What level of structure is truly necessary? And again, not applying that, this is how we do it on the employee side, to everything, really understanding the different ways of engaging. And I think the risk conversation that we had ties directly into that. Yeah, really scaling non-employee talent without adding bureaucracy is an art because there is new risk to add. You can build a shared infrastructure for things that make sense, like compliance with identity theft, but you can have different workflows for independents versus employees in terms of letting the manager make the decision about, what they want to use, as long as you have common rules of the road and you let people do what they're good at.
So to close, if HR leaders take away just one mindset shift from this conversation today with you, what should it be?
I would say that HR is at a very interesting inflection point, the entire concept of HR. As work becomes more distributed and technology becomes more capable and more widely used, the opportunity in HR is not just about choosing the right type of worker. It's about maximizing the combined value of people and technology and process and control. Organizations that will grow the fastest and have the smoothest experience getting talent, using talent, maximizing talent are those where HR designs a system. And I don't mean by one system as a physical thing, but an orchestration of systems that enable flexibility for their business stakeholders, innovation, while still protecting the business from risk. That shift from restricting which workers I can use to stewarding, here's how you use the workers as you find them, is really where HR becomes a true growth function for their business stakeholders. That's my perception.
I think you're onto something here. Colleen, thank you so much for a thoughtful and grounded discussion today.
Thank you, Marilyn. I really appreciate being here.
So to our listeners, the future of HR, as Colleen said, is bright. And it isn't about choosing between technology, compliance, or flexibility. It's about integrating all three with intention.
Support for this show comes from Western Carolina University, a campus of the University of North Carolina system, with the technical assistance of Kelly Minnis.